Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A New Day Yesterday, UK Progressive Rock and the 1970s, by Mike Barnes. Narrated by Matthew Lloyd Davies. Introduction. More songs about wizards and hobbits. Progressive rock. Isn't that about wizards? Asked a considerably younger friend via email when I told her that I was thinking of writing this book. Well, yes and no, I replied, and then changed the subject, amused but also rather embarrassed by her perception of my literary intention. Afterwards I had a bit of a think. There was a band called Silly Wizard, but they were more folk rock. The Wizard of the Keys was a minor character in Gong's Radio Gnome trilogy. Uriah Heep released an album, Demons and Wizards, in 1972. But although they had some aspects in common with the progressive rockers, they also had another stack-heeled boot in the hard rock camp. Rick Wakeman was known in 70s parlance as a keyboard wizard, and had posed for promotional photographs for his 1975 concept album, The Myths and Legends of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, wearing a conical wizard's hat. But best stop there. The heyday of progressive rock is long enough ago now for received wisdom to suggest that it was all about wizards, elves, and hobbits, and so it should be retrofitted thus and consigned en masse to the dustbin of history. But in fact almost none of it had anything to do with this fantastical roll call. So what are we actually talking about here? What is, or was, progressive rock? Labelling music into genres may be a journalistic construct, but there is usually a rough consensus. Free jazz, jazz rock, Britpop, soul, blues, funk, grunge, hardcore, rave, folk, and ambient all conjure up an aural image of their typical sounds. If we are talking about Merseybeat, then we know we are dealing with beat music that was initially played in the Liverpool area in the early to mid-60s. But progressive rock defies easy categorization. It's a term that, according to the majority of the musicians I have spoken to, was rarely used to describe the music as it was made in the 70s, but has since become a way of labelling a wide-ranging genre, while its modern shorthand, prog, can be used pejoratively. Imagine saying it while pulling a face. But one has to start somewhere, and for the purposes of this book, progressive rock was essentially ushered in by the burst of creativity in the psychedelic era, from 1966 to 68. Although era seems a bit of a grand title for a shift in creative thinking whose first phase lasted only a couple of years. But such are the ways that we attempt to make sense of changes within an artistic continuum. The first major wave of progressive rock swelled up in 1969, reached its peak in the mid-70s, and then began to dissipate into different tributaries towards the end of the decade. But the 70s was a particularly open, fertile, and mutable time musically, with so many different influences and styles feeding into what was played, that borders and definitions remain contestable. After psychedelia had thrown open the doors of perception, the challenge was to impose order on its lengthy, expressive freakouts, and the chaos that these could potentially lead to, and to experiment with form, structure, and dynamics. The imperative was to make new musical shapes. With progressive rock, anything was creatively possible and, stylistically, everything was up for grabs. And so the groups mixed up elements of rock and roll, R&B, psychedelia, classical, the avant-garde, folk, jazz, free improvisation, non-Western influences, and more soul than is generally acknowledged, even attempts at multimedia, into brand new musical hybrids. Lyrics encompassed social satire, invented worlds, sci-fi, ideas from literature, stream of consciousness word paintings, a hippyish striving for enlightenment, a few love songs, and even a smattering of politics. As always with these musical shifts, there was no clear beginning. The earliest example this writer has seen of progressive in print, as an adjective to describe rock music, was with reference to the psychedelic group Tomorrow, in early 1968, while in that year the Small Faces were referred to by Keith Altham in the New Musical Express as progressive pop. Jimi Hendrix was also labelled progressive in some quarters, an accolade he certainly deserved. The P-word was used to describe Caravan in the sleeve notes of their self-titled debut album in October 1968. But it was in use even before then. Melody Maker journalist Chris Welsh claims he was the first writer to coin the phrase progressive rock when writing about Cream in 1967, in a nod back to progressive jazz, the way pianist Stan Kenton described his music of the late 40s. Writing in International Times in 1970, Mark Williams described Caravan, Soft Machine, Mighty Baby and Family as British ethnic rock music. An interesting idea, but the label never stuck. In the late 60s, rock and roll music was still alive and well, with many of its pioneers still playing, but it was beginning to show its age. In this new post-psychedelic artistic climate, rock and roll was suddenly expanded by a mass of new ideas, creating a different kind of rock music. Calling it progressive was as good a nomenclature as any. Music is constantly progressing anyway, but in the early 70s, developments in rock music happened at an unusual speed, with musicians eager to stride into the new creative space that was opening before them. Suddenly, basic 4/4-12-bar rock and roll seemed anachronistic, like something from the distant past, as rock was now open-ended and could potentially go anywhere and everywhere. Ian Anderson of Jethro Tull has this to say on progressive rock's questing spirit. When I was asked to define what makes a progressive rock musician, I said, well, it's a person who just gets bored easily. People who think, well, I can do that, but what's next? What was initially envisaged as a sustainable, imaginative alternative to mainstream pop, with one foot still in the counterculture, could, on paper, have been a minority interest, but eventually became, in the case of some groups, commercially huge in the heyday of the album. Major labels caught on and invested substantial amounts of money in this new thing, and there was enough of a market to allow a number of independent labels to spring up. And with a record-buying public looking for new kicks, it also infiltrated the charts, with hit singles in the early 70s by Jethro Tull and Family in particular, who made appearances on the BBC TV singles charts showcase Top of the Pops. Other reactions from friends to the news of this book project ranged from raised eyebrows of interest to lip-curling sneers of disdain. Such divided reactions are nothing new. Progressive rock was both revered and reviled in its heyday from 1969 to 74. And there's the rub. One musician I talked to, a practicing punk of a certain age, admitted that although he'd liked to read the book, he couldn't stand the music and that, obviously, Yes was shit. I was concerned, although not entirely surprised, that to some, this music was simply synonymous with naff, or less polite descriptors. Although this easy way of dismissing nearly a decade's worth of music bothered me, I could see why it had arisen. At its height, progressive rock was powerful and potent enough to attract millions of fervent, true believers. But when it began to lose its way in the mid to late 70s, a view shared by many of the musicians I have spoken to, it did what no other form of 20th century popular music had managed to do. It provoked a backlash of epic proportions. The emergence of UK punk rock in 1976. Punk signalled a huge shift in attitudes as to what rock music was for, particularly in the relationship between the musicians and their audience. It was fundamentally opposed not just to progressive rock, but to all big established rock acts who had lost touch with their audience. Whereas the sheer scale of the most commercially successful specimens had once been impressive in itself, progressive rock groups of all shapes and sizes became classified as dinosaurs, while the punks were portrayed in some sections of the music press as avenging angels who had emerged sui generis to preside over a year zero cull, standing on the shores, brandishing their weapons as these giant musical sauropods, who had once ruled the world unopposed, now slid sadly off into the swamps to their extinction. Except it wasn't quite like that. Like many 70s teenagers, I embraced punk and the enormous amount of new music that followed in its wake. But I also had an abiding affection for progressive rock, having grown up with the big boys like Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Jethro Tull, Pink Floyd, Yes, Genesis and Mike Oldfield, as well as the more esoteric strains of King Crimson, Gong, and Hatfield and the North. From the early 90s, I went on a trip around the musical world, becoming a published music journalist, perennially drawn to the new, and largely writing about music to the left of the mainstream. And progressive rock groups seemed more a thing of the past than of the present. So why did I decide to write this book? Well, put simply, I was approached. I immediately turned down the offer. But the more I churned the idea over in my mind, the more I was drawn back to the music of that era. I was also beginning to notice more 70s progressive rock groups being mentioned positively in the music. These views now coming from a different generation to the ones who had called for the cull back in the day. They were able to hear the music as it was, without all of its historical and critical baggage. Although I was brought up with progressive rock, I had been away from it for long enough to not be a partisan apologist. But as the connections were still there, I was curious enough to be able to retrace my steps back to it, to attempt to make sense of it and look at it with some kind of objectivity. Importantly, I wanted to try to get rid of the barrier of received wisdom, and to show there was an alternative viewpoint to that of yes, obviously being shit. One of the highlights of the 2009 BBC4 documentary Prog Rock Britannia was keyboard player Rick Wakeman's tongue-in-cheek portrayal of a punter going into a record store to buy some prog albums long after its heyday. He acted out the protagonist's furtiveness as like that of a man buying a top-shelf mag in a newsagent's full of female customers, keen to have the vendor slip his purchase into an inconspicuous brown paper bag as quickly as possible to allow a hasty exit. It was exaggerated for comic effect, but exemplified contemporary prog rock fans as lonely male misfits, harbouring a love that dared not speak its name, at least not in public. I grimaced at some of my taste lapses as an impressionable youth, and also recognized things that had completely escaped me in my younger days. But although this involved me undergoing some self-administered regression therapy sessions, including one memorable night spent with numerous bottles of strong cider, a jar of home-grown weed, and a pile of Emerson, Lake and Palmer vinyl LPs, in an attempt to establish what had fired me up about their music in the first place, my intention was not just to go on some kind of rock heritage nostalgia trip. There was a story that needed to be told in a particular way. To get this story, my aim was to speak to as many musicians as was reasonably practical, as well as radio DJs, record company people, and journalists. And also the fans, the long-haired kids who bought the music. For progressive rock was made for and consumed by young people. I intended to investigate the era, to get as close as I could to the feeling of being back in the 70s. Crucially, the narrative has been largely shaped by hundreds of hours of interviews with those who were there, and many of their observations have been both fascinating and unexpected. In the early 70s, progressive rock was hallmarked by musicians who let their imaginations off the leash, producing music that moved away from previous givens, in sync with an audience who demanded, to be presented with something new. The decade was a time of cultural and countercultural change in terms of politics, the media, idealism, literature, philosophy, and personal aspirations. These were woven, to greater and lesser extents, into the music, together with the developments in technology that made it all possible. I also explore the fads and fashions, the sights, sounds, and even smells of the era, the whiff of dope smoke, joss sticks and patchouli oil, clinging to scoop-neck shirts, and the reek of the poorly cured leather of cheap Afghan coats and desert boots, all waft through the story. The remit of the book is deliberately restricted. I felt that as progressive rock started in the UK, then that would be the geographical focus of my investigations, which also wouldn't stray temporarily beyond the 70s, and would concentrate on the first half of that decade. Music scenes in other countries will be briefly mentioned, but I will leave an in-depth exploration of these to others. My survey is detailed, but doesn't pretend to be exhaustive. It soon proved too repetitious to chart every group's history in detail, so my narrative concentrates on particular areas and elements, and is interspersed with more detailed surveys of key albums. To write all this in chronological order would have resulted in an unholy pile-up of information. So after sending out markers to the late 70s early on, I have hopped back and forth, filling in the gaps. I'm sure that those who like their music with twists and turns, time changes, abrupt halts, and recapitulation of themes will find no problem with this approach. The inclusion of certain groups will run counter to some notions of what was progressive rock, but they are included because so much invention was taking place within the same media, and, as always, stylistic labels came later. In the early 70s, as the bass player and guitarist in Kevin Ayers' group The Whole World, Mike Oldfield had played on some stylistically diverse bills. In the days that prog rock started, there were no differences between any kind of music, he recalls. You'd get to mix with everyone from Pink Floyd to Free to Hawkwind. There was no difference. None of these categories existed. Prog didn't even exist. Nobody said, "I'm in a progressive band." We were all in there together. Some musicians wished to distance themselves from their 70s peers, and also the very notion of progressive rock. "Progressive rock, don't know anything about it," snapped one particularly cantankerous lead vocalist, who accused me of trying to make money out of him before the interview ground to a halt. The inclusion of Hawkwind raised eyebrows among friends, some of whom thought they were part of a different scene altogether, but the group's saxophonist Nick Turner was happy to be included, and that was good enough for me. Similarly, jazz pianist Keith Tippett, who was the creative force behind Centipede, one of the more groundbreaking projects of the 70s, a large ensemble drawing on players from classical, rock, jazz, and free improvisation, claimed, with some justification, that they were the most progressive group of the era, so I was hardly going to shut him out. Robert Wyatt, who had played with Soft Machine and Matching Mole, and Centipede, was, as always, an entertaining and gracious interviewee, but was particularly keen to distance himself from progressive rock, for reasons that will become clear later on. However, Wyatt also delivered two startlingly new-sounding solo albums in the mid-70s. So, sorry, Robert, but you were progressive something or other, and it wouldn't be the same without you, so you were in. Other groups missed out completely, so apologies to the excellent Jade Warrior, to Manfred Mann's Earth Band, Gnidralog, and more. The heyday of progressive rock was a heady time of artistic freedom and accelerated creativity unique in rock music's history. At best, it found groups fearlessly breaking into new areas and initiating new musical forms. At worst, it saw them exhibiting delusions of grandeur, overreaching themselves, and getting lost in the maze of possibilities in which they had been allowed to roam free. When musing on the birth of King Crimson back in 1969, the group's guitarist Robert Fripp had this to say about lyricist Pete Sinfield's flamboyant modus operandi. He did not know what he could not do. By implication, this applied to Fripp, the rest of the group, and many other musicians besides. And so this book is dedicated to all those musicians who did not know what they could not do. And this is their story. Mike Barnes, 2019. Chapter 1. It's All Too Beautiful. Psychedelia and the British Psyche. The date is April 22, the first spring day of 2016 that actually feels like spring. There is sun and birdsong, and the warming air seems animated, alive, slowly dispelling the last vestiges of winter gloom. It's the time when those who have been hibernating most deeply experience the slightly disturbing pleasure of being wrenched, blinking, back out into the daylight. The walk south towards Ilford from Gants Hill tube station takes me along a wide and busy street lined with substantial mock Tudor semis. This indicates that I am in suburbia now, just beyond the edge of London's East End. As I walk in through the gates of Valentine's Park, I come across a pond with scattered slices of white bread and a pile of cheese puffs left on the bankside for the wildfowl. Canada geese sail away, snootily disdaining this human being's idea of an avian smorgasbord, although the park's noisy crow population are taking an interest and one flies off with a cheesy snack in its beak. Valentine's Park, like many parks in London, was once the grounds and gardens of a substantial property. Valentine's Mansion was built in 1696 and, paid for by national lottery money, extensive renovation was carried out in 2007, including restoration of the walled gardens. The architectural features of particular interest in the grounds are the three 18th-century grottos bordering the Long Water, a narrow man-made lake about 100 metres long. Two of these grottos stand at each end of the lake at water level, one of which is occupied by a swan. A third grotto overlooks the water from terra firma, and is occupied by a man with a mobile phone and several cans of lager. Mallards, swans, moorhens, and tufted ducks paddle around. One broody moorhen has built a nest of twigs on the bank. The fish pond, an adjoining lake with a large island in the middle, would have been a safer sight. A little girl rolls away from her mother on unwieldy roller skates. Joggers jog by in succession, and groups of kids in school uniform cut through the park on their way home. But still the atmosphere is unexpectedly tranquil. In case this all seems a little less than relevant to the subject matter of this book, all journeys start with a single step, and mine finds me in Ichiku Park, the subject of a 1967 single by the Small Faces. The Ichikus of the title were nettles, which could give a nasty sting to an unsuspecting 50s schoolboy dressed in shorts. This is also the book's first contentious point. The song was written by bass guitarist Ronnie Lane and singer and guitarist Steve Marriott. Lane has said it was written about a park in Ilford. Some of Marriott's school friends remember the Nettles being at Little Ilford Park about a mile to the south. But Marriott has specifically identified it as Valentine's Park. Drummer Kenny Jones prefers to think it is referring to King Edward Memorial Park in Shadwell, but Valentine's Park seems the best fit for the venue. In the bridge passages into the choruses of the song, Marriott sings of feeding the ducks with a bun, and while Little Ilford Park contains no bodies of water, Valentine's has 3 lakes and ducks aplenty. It's unclear exactly which one park, if indeed it were just one, inspired the song, and references to Oxford's Dreaming Spires and Cambridge's Bridge of Sighs are thrown in to make up a composite place. but that only adds to the mystery. There are no dreaming spires in sight of Valentine's Park, just a single, rather wary-looking tower block. And as I stand reflecting on all this, I realize that being in one of a number of its possible locations is rather like standing atop Glastonbury Tor, which some claim to be the Isle of Avalon, collaring a passerby and asking, "Excuse me, where is Camelot?" It's a question without an answer. The reason I had gone looking for its location is that the song epitomizes a peculiarly late-60s English way of looking through a metaphorical lens, be it drug-induced or not, at the everyday, and transforming it via the imagination into something transcendental, almost mystical. And as such, it was one of the most potent songs of the psychedelic era, which, at most, lasted just a couple of years from 1966 to the beginning of 1968. Mythical places are so entrenched in our race memory that the fact that one only has access to them through the imagination strengthens their allure. Millions of people will have an image in their minds of Ichiku Park. And in the mind is where the action was taking place. Most importantly, the song was inspired by memories of the group members' youths, and, in common with many late 60s British musicians, the Small Faces were re-evaluating who they were musically by travelling back to their childhoods, a time when they could dream and play in a relatively untroubled way, and when days were always sunny and full of untested possibilities. Musically, the times were changing fast. The Small Faces had started out in 1965 as fresh-faced, sharply dressed teenage mods purveying a mixture of soul, R&B, and brill-building pop. Into 1967, fellow mods, The Who, were purveying an updated image of aggressive dandyism, both in the expanded range of their music and their on-stage equipment smashing. But the Small Faces were still seen as teen pin-ups, and locked into something akin to Beatlemania. With Ichiku Park, the group began to veer into more personal territory, while still making a brilliant experimental pop single. They epitomized the way that many British musicians at this time were moving away from their influences and pursuing more individual ideas. Ian McLagan weaves piano and organ phrases around Marriott's jaunty acoustic strum. Lane's dreamy conspiratorial backing vocals agree with the singer in how cool it would be to miss out school. Then, with his voice swathed in flanging, a new technique of manually putting tape signals out of phase, making a disorientating whooshing sound, which is pretty much synonymous with phasing, Marriott sings about his intention to blow his mind, before leaving a 2-bar gap for Jones's flanged drums and cymbals to travel across the sound field, leaving sonic vapor trails in their wake, and leading into a simple chorus in which the scene is described as all too beautiful. Given the locale that spawned the song, these gushing sentiments might be taken as ironic. But Marriott sounds genuinely, unabashedly overwhelmed by the beauty of things, by these thoughts of a sunny afternoon stoned in the park, a precious oasis of green in the capital city. By 1967, this exploration and re-establishment of self was probably practiced more vigorously by musicians like the Small Faces than, say, trainee surveyors. But this pop song, with its memorable tune and alluring sound world, and a top 10 hit for the group, reimagined humdrum Britain as somewhere that really could be perceived as being all too beautiful. The idea was immensely attractive. But before we immerse ourselves more fully in psychedelia, we need to wind back to the first musical memories of the Small Faces and their peers. Those musicians born around the end of World War II, and their audience, of similar age or born up to the end of the 50s. In the decade or so following World War II, the principal remit of mainstream public broadcasting was to be educational and impartial along the lines drawn by Lord Reith at the foundation of the BBC in the 20s. In terms of music, the idea was to provide a sense of comfort and order, which in turn fostered a largely static...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?